responsible for creating internet drafts and other documents that are working group products. We do have a way to adopt something that's not a working group process, not through the working group process, and I'll mention that in a bit. The working groups are broken up into areas for managerial efficiency, not necessarily crisp borders between the areas. There are things in the applications area which could just as soon go in the RAI area and vice versa. It's not a crisp environment. It's mostly what the area directors are interested in. Each area has one, two, or three area directors, and they manage the activities in the area. They are responsible for figuring out when working groups should be started up and when they should be stopped. Monitoring the activities of the working group, monitoring the quality of the documents produced by the working groups, and the like. The area directors sitting together as a body make up the IESG, Internet Engineering Steering Group. And in the IETF, the IESG is the body which decides whether something's going to be published as an RFC, and therefore as a standard, or in some cases informational. But it's the IESG who gets to decide this, with input from the community, and you'll see how that works in a minute. There is also a Internet Architecture Board, which doesn't have any formal authority. It used to. Once upon a time, that was the body that made the technology decisions and approved RFCs, but there was a palace revolt and they were kicked out. And the ISG was created to wasn't created, but ISG was assigned the authority that the IAB once had. And the reason that there was a palace revolt was that the IAB was seen as getting too remote and doing their own thing rather than involving the community, rather than involving the working groups and involving the individuals in the community. They were seen as doing their own thing too much, and so they were slapped down. That hasn't happened to the ISG yet, but it might. We'll see. These are the RETF areas, applications, there were the number of working groups in each one. Some of them are pretty big. I mean, the ART, which has 3 area directors, has 46 working groups. That's a lot of working groups. And some people say that's too many working groups, but be as it may, that's what's happening. The area directors do manage the activities within an area. They're trying to ensure the quality of materials. If they decide on what the general direction of the area, what is the scope of that area, what topics they're going to cover. They're required to manage the process itself to be sure that working groups are making progress. And if working group isn't making progress because maybe it's talking too much, or maybe the people, the volunteers in charge involved in it aren't doing their thing quite as much as they might, the area directors are supposed to figure out what to do about that. Maybe change chairs in working groups, maybe change the document editors within a working group, that sort of thing. They approve birds of a feather sessions, and I'll tell you what a BOF is in a few minutes. They do have the authority to make major changes, but that's very rarely exercised. I was an area director for a number of years, for about a decade, and I had to change working group chairs a few times. They weren't happy about it, but that's part of the job you have to do. Also had to change document editors a few times. And the area directors is hired, if hired is the right term for a volunteer organization, for their technical ability. So the security area directors are experts in security. Transport area directors are experts in transport. And they're expected to review the documents that come out of the working groups in their areas for their technical competence before they're handed off to the rest of the ISG. So unlike many standards bodies where the working group does its thing and produces a document, and then from then on it's processed. In the IETF, the working group produces a document, it gets reviewed by the area director for technical functions, and then it's handed to the ISG, which also does a review, technical review, a cross-area technical review. So the security people review the stuff that comes out of the operations area, and the transport people review things that come out of the security area, to be sure that we have a full range of opinions and full range of technical review on these proposals. So one of the disadvantages of the traditional method where the working group does all of the work is the working group is not, by definition, not a broad thing. A working group is a group of people who are interested in a particular topic rather than a broad span of all of the topics that are necessary to ensure that the technology is manageable and secure and all of those things. So the second level review that we have in the area directors and the ISG try to make the technology more secure, better technology in general. So that's what I just said. The ISG does all of this stuff. They are the review board and the approval board. They're the group that's responsible and for creating working groups and for tearing down working groups when their job is done. So the work of the IETF is in working groups. It's not anywhere else. It's in working groups, and it's in the corridors, actually, in the bar at night. It's that sort of thing. You'll hear about a barb-off from time to time, and that's people getting together to work on some problem. The formal work, though, is done in working groups. And the working group activity is to create documents, which are then reviewed by the community and then adopted by the ISG. The first stage of any documents is the internet draft. Internet draft is the musings of an individual, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. That is then worked on within a working group, and different generations of the internet draft are done to reflect the working group consensus as it goes along. Once the working group believes that this is ready for publication, then it's handed off to the area director for the area director's review. And if the area director believes it's ready, if the area director doesn't believe it's ready, it sends it back. He or she sends it back to the working group for more work. If the area director believes it's ready, it then goes off to the ISG. And the first thing the ISG does is to issue a IETF last call, a message sent out to the entire IETF community saying, this document has been submitted to the ISG for adoption. What do you think? And it goes to the whole community. And that the people outside the working group specifically wants to bring in the people who are not part of that working group, who have different expertise and can look at this with a different set of eyes. So we want to do that. And then the ISG then takes the results of that last call and their own evaluation and decides what to do. They can kick it back to the working group for more work, or they can tell the RFC editor to publish it as an RFC. The IETF is not a traditional standards development organization. It's certainly a informal, all of you got the message. I only see one tie, and that's right over there. There's a tie. The lady's wearing a tie. And that's okay. That's okay. No, there's nothing against that. We do have 3 people who regularly come to these meetings that wear ties, but it's not the kind of formal thing. And I've been at other standards bodies where anybody in the room has to address the chair. Mr. Chair, that guy's a jerk. It's a very different way to deal with things than we've got here. We've got a lot of people here who are technically savvy, but socially questionable. Let's say they're overly direct, and you may find that's difficult, and we find it's difficult. It doesn't make newcomers as welcome as it should, and we would like to do something about that. We've tried in the past to try and tell people to be nicer to other people, and it works some of them out. If you run into trouble, if somebody is not treating you well, then let us know. Let somebody with a dot know that's going on, because we don't want that. We want you to feel welcome because we want your input, we want your help, we want to exploit you. We want your technical abilities. So some of these people can be quite blunt. Some of them with real cause. I mean, they're blunt because they see silliness and they want to correct it. But that's not the right way to do it. And it's an unfortunate feature. We have our own culture. We've been around for a long time. So we've got our ways to do things, and they're not going to. The ways aren't going to change because you're here. You've got to adopt, if you're going to succeed in this organization, you have to adopt some of our culture. Whether that's, you're going to find that pleasant or not, that's really not the issue. It's just part of the way things get done. If you go to any standards organization, go to the ITU or the ETSI or ISO, you have to adopt to their culture. So it's nothing special about the fact you have to adopt here, but it is worse than some areas because we're not quite as formal. And that informality means that people can get insulted when they shouldn't be. Either end of they shouldn't be. The person who's doing the insulting shouldn't be insulting, and the person who's receiving it shouldn't be insulted. But we do try and do the best we can, but if you do run into trouble, please let us know. Sort of the first step in many, very first step in many technology, which wind up to being an RFC, is an internet draft. An individual publishes an internet draft. You've got this great idea for a marvelous pinochle playing protocol. And so you write an internet draft about that, and you publish that internet draft. And you rally people around who like pinochle, and they want to talk about it. Once you get enough people that you think that are interested in this, you go to an area director and say, I got this great protocol. I think it should be a standard. And sometimes the area director will say, great, it's perfect stuff, it's exactly what we need to be doing, I've got the right number of people and the right enthusiasm, and the internet draft's a great one, so let's just create a working group. But more often, the area director will say, well, let's find out whether there's interest in the community. And the way they do that is to create a birds of a feather session. It's an ad hoc session, usually held only once per topic. And that's a way for the area director to gauge the level of interest. Now, birds of a feather sessions can also be for other purposes. They can be just general information. When I was area director, we had a birds of a feather session on what big companies would do for internet if they could control it, technology-wise, not process-wise or social-wise. And we brought in people from FedEx and the big banks and lots of big companies. And they all said, actually, almost universally, they said they wanted predictability, quality of service predictability. They wanted this internet to work the same way today as it did yesterday and the same way tomorrow as it did today. They wanted regularity. That was great. That was not a birds of a feather session that was designed to create a working group. It was just for the information of the community. But most birds of a feather sessions, and the ones that are going on this week, are ones that are designed to see whether there's enough interest to develop to create a working group. And during that process, the area director is trying to figure out whether there's enough interest, enough people that are going to work on it, that the ideas are crisp enough, that they're well enough directed. It's not pure research. If it's pure research, we kick it over the corner to the IETF. IETF is trying to make technologies that people can run and are useful. So part of all that sort of stuff is done in the birds of a feather session. I do remember one case where I had a birds of a feather session, big popular topic. It was 300 or so people in the room, which is a pretty good size turnout for that sort of thing. And at the end, I got up as area director and said, okay, well, how many people think that this is ready to be an IETF working group? And about half the people stuck up their hands. And you'll see that's actually a pretty big number. Because most of the time, people just sit there and, I don't know, and they don't say anything, and they don't stick up their hand. They don't express an opinion. They just sort of sit there. A lot of observers in this community. Said, okay, that's cool. How many people don't think it should be? And the other half stuck up their hand. So we had about everybody express an opinion, and they were diametrically opposed. So I concluded from that it wasn't ready to be a working group. And it became a working group a number of years later, but that was the kind of thing that I figured out as an area director using a birds of a feather session. So working groups are where the work's done, sometimes preceded by a BOF, but basically this is where the work is done. Note that a working group, you don't have to come to an IETF meeting. I've already said this. You don't have to come to an IETF meeting to be part of a working group. In fact, you will see the sessions that you go to this week are not really a place where you do a lot of work. The IETF meeting, we have this meeting, I have a list of how many sessions there are. There's not enough time in the week to actually do the actual work. Some standards bodies meet for 2 weeks and they sit there and they edit the document for 2 weeks in a particular working group. But it's not the way we work here. Now you've got a session that might be an hour and a half or 2 hours, and some of them are 2.5 hours. That's all. 2.5 hour session for a whole week, and that's for the work of the working group. Well, you can't use it to write the document. You can't use it to write the standard. What you use it for is to understand the high order bits. What's a problem? Try and resolve problems where the face-to-face communication is helpful to do that. But you don't write the actual internet drafts or the RFCs in a working group meeting itself, because there's not enough time to do that. So the meetings themselves are very short. As I already mentioned, it's mostly bottoms up. It's you guys coming up with an idea and then bringing that forth, rather than the area director or the IAB imposing an idea. A topic. Working groups have charters. A charter is a contract. Now, having a contract with volunteer labor is somewhat pointless, but that's the idea. So the contract says, here's what you're going to work on, here's what you're not going to work on. If you bring an idea to a working group and it's not in their charter, they're not permitted to working on it. They can go back to the area director and the ISG saying, let's change the charter to include this. But you'll frequently hear the message from the working group chairs, it's not in the charter, we can't work on this. Because it's trying to restrict the working group to working on a particular set of topics so that maybe we'll get some work done, rather than keep growing it. In theory, working groups are closed when their job's done. In practice, sometimes they're not, sometimes they are. We've got some working groups that have been very long-lived because they keep getting new topics to do. But unlike many standards bodies where if you get your work done in a working group, you're given more work by definition because you've been successful. In the IETF, most of the time the working groups are closed when their job's done, which can be quite a shock to somebody coming from one of those other organizations, because suddenly the working group goes away and they feel insulted. But that's not the case. The case is you did a good job and now we move on to something else. Here's the pictorial diagram of how working groups are created. You may have a BOF, you have come up with a working group charter and description. That goes to the area director. The area director polices that and figures out whether that's something they want to do. Maybe hold a BOF to figure out how much interest there is. Then it goes to the ISG, which then sends a message out to the community. And, by the way, this thing in the lower left-hand corner here, new work. One of the criticisms we got a number of years ago was we were off doing our own things, which sometimes was completely in parallel and contradictory to work being done in other standards organizations. So what we did was we created this new work list where participants, or more likely management, and other standards organizations can subscribe to this mailing list. And they will get notice whenever we're thinking of creating a working group, so that they can say, oops, we're already working in this area, please work with us, or don't do that because we're working in it, we're this far along in it. It's a way to get feedback from the other standards organizations and keep them up to on what we're doing. And they in turn do the same thing for us. They send us notes through the new work list and therefore to all the other standards organizations on the new work list to let us know what they're doing. So we're trying to get some level of cooperation, not necessarily coordination. We're not saying the ITU should do this and the IETF should do that. We're saying at least they know each other, what the others are doing, so they can do some coordination. So I've already mentioned the working groups meetings are very short. They don't sit around you don't have a lot of time to sit around and work on a document. You just work on the high order issues. So if you're going to a working group, which I hope that's why you're here, is to go to working groups. You go to a working group and there's a bunch of discussion about particular topics. If you know something about that and you have read the documents, stand up at the microphone and talk. Tell them what you think. But conditionally, you do it when you know what you're talking about. There's an old saying of don't open your mouth and prove you're a fool, let people just guess. So you want to be careful about that. But if you do know what you're talking about, then definitely do stand up and talk. These sessions are live streamed, and they're recorded for future. They're audio streamed and video streamed. There's cameras right here. There's a couple of different cameras around. They're live streamed all over the world. So when you go to the microphone, you are talking to the world through that microphone. So like the microphone. Talk to the microphone. Don't do it down here. Don't talk over there. Talk to the microphone. Pretend to like the microphone. Look directly at the microphone. If the person over here asked you the question, don't look at them. Look at the microphone. Because the people out there in audio land can't hear you unless you're talking into the microphone. And second, because it's also audio streamed, not just video streamed, and because there's somebody taking notes, always say who you are. You walk to the microphone, you say, it's so-and-so, Fred Smith, Scott Bradner, whatever. You don't say who you're from, because that's irrelevant, but you say, "This is my name." And then I go off and have the opinion, whatever I want to say. You need to say that every time, even though you were there 3 seconds before, because the person taking the notes is not looking at you, and the people on audio won't necessarily recognize your voice. So every time you go to the microphone, say who you are. You will see blue sheets. You don't have them in this session, but you'll see what are called blue sheets in all sessions and all other regular sessions. And they are a listing of who's attending this meeting. This is important for openness. Whenever you're doing technology standards, you want to know who is involved in the creation of the standards. It's a fact for all types of standards organizations. And the way we do it is you sign the blue sheet. Now, we don't have any police watching you to be sure that you do sign it, but please, sign the blue sheet. Used to be that you signed it with your name and your email address. We dropped the email address because we couldn't just publish the blue sheets with email address on them because people would use them as spam bait. So we've now changed it so the blue sheets are just have your name, and I don't remember me you have your organization. I think you have an organization. They are scanned immediately and published, and then we destroy them. But it's a record of who's participating in the activity. That's very important for intellectual property reasons and just for fairness in general. We want to know who's discussing these things. This week, 133 sessions, of which 119 are unique, meaning that some working groups have more than one session. Of that, there are 11 BOFs and 7 BOFs and 11 IRTF sessions. We'll talk about that in a second. There's a administration and technical plenary, which is not going to have anything technical in it this time. I'm not quite sure why, but there isn't going to be anything technical in the administrative and technical plenary, but I urge you to go anyway, because it's a place where the community can talk back to the management. Folks, there's an open mic for the ISG to talk back to the ISG, an open mic for the IAB and the IOC, all the different community groups that are sort of managing one way or another the IETF. There's a Bits and Bytes session on Thursday evening, and this is technology. It's companies purchasing tables to show off their wares and to make watching the technology easier. There's booze and cookies, or nibbles of various types. So come and get a little bit of alcohol and see some technology. BOFs are a good way to figure out where the IETF's going or might go, and so there are a set of BOFs this week. There's Babel routing protocol, low power wide area networks, alternative resolution context for internet naming, limited use remote keys, etc. If you're interested in any of those topics, there will be at the session, the meeting session this afternoon, the reception this afternoon, the posters for each of these BOFs. So look at the posters to see whether you'll be interested in them, and if you are, go to them. Find that it is showing the future directions. And then there's going to be a special BOF from the general area on how we figure out where we're going to go, meeting-wise, not otherwise. How do we decide to meet here versus someplace else? And so if you have input to that, if you have opinions on how the IETF should make the decision on where to come to actually have meetings, there's a BOF that will be talking about that. If you're generally interested in what's going on in areas and in the transport area or the like, and what they might be doing next. These open area meetings are a good way to find out. So there's a set of them this week, there's 5 of them this week, and it's definitely worth taking a look at them because they are looking at the cutting edge stuff in the area. So at the beginning I had that quote from Dave Clark, rough consensus and running code. Well, the IETF decided to do this, to use this concept of rough consensus, as opposed to consensus, which is in many standards bodies. Consensus, as Margaret Thatcher once has famously have said, consensus is where everybody is equally dissatisfied. Well, that's not the way we do it. We use rough consensus, which means some people are very dissatisfied, but the rest are satisfied. And that, what we're saying there is not everybody has to agree. If you've got a bee in your bonnet and you want this particular result and nobody else cares and nobody else really supports you, we're going to move on. You might be upset, but we're going to move on. We don't have to have everybody in agreement. That's a relatively easy thing to do in a room, in a meeting room. It's hard to do in a mailing list to understand what level of consensus there is. Because in a mailing list, one guy who types very well and who's got a lot of extra time can dominate the discussion. But in a room like this, how do we figure out what the consensus is? Well, we do a couple different ways. One way we get derided for, but let's try it. So, show of hands. How many people took more than 4 hours to get to this meeting? And how many people took less than 4 hours to get to this meeting? Some people don't know how long it took. So the rough consensus is it takes an IETF meeting is more than 4 hours away. Now, no, I didn't count. I just sort of looked at the general milieu to see how many people were saying one way or the other. If you see somebody counting in a meeting, a showing of hands, then that's a mistake, because that's not what you're trying to find out. You're trying to find out whether the predominant view is one thing or another. Now, what happens, let's say that you work for Mike. Your opinion is different than Mike's. If you put up your hand when I say, should we do this, and Mike thinks you shouldn't do that, that's not going to be a good day back at the farm. So what do? We have another way of finding out the level of consensus, and that's a hum. So let's try this. Hum if it took you more than 4 hours to get here. Hum if it took you less than 4 hours to get here. So we now know what the consensus is, but we don't know that he disagrees with his boss. You'll see a lot of those types of things. You'll see that happening a lot in these meetings. The idea is to get the rough idea of how much consensus there is. If the hum volumes are equal, we don't have consensus. It's not time to move on. We have to continue to discuss and trying to come up with the right solution. So, IETF documents. All IETF documents are open. They're open for anybody. As we can download them, you can print them out, you can sell them. And we've had history where companies have downloaded RFCs, packaged them up onto books and sell them. And that's fine. We don't care. That's great. It gets the stuff out there. It used to be that you couldn't, if you were at a library, you wanted a printed book. We didn't do printed books. So the fact that some companies did that was great. There's no inhibition at all. We also have a blanket permission for anybody to translate any IETF document to another language without having to get any permission at all. It's just part of baked into the rule set. So you can do anything you want with it, as long as you're doing it in full. You can't take an IETF document, modify it, and then republish it as your document. You've got to take it in full and say where you got it and things like that. I've mentioned internet drafts a bunch of times. Internet drafts is sort of the first stage. An internet draft is some individual's ideas, or could be a working group's ideas. But there's no admissions control on internet drafts. Anybody can publish an internet draft on any topic. And if you look at the Internet Drafts Directory, you can see there's no admissions control. There's some very strange internet drafts out there. We have somebody solving Fermat's theorem. We've had other things. We've got three bits with three values, things like that that showed up in internet drafts. And they weren't April Fool's Day RFCs. They were serious. So anybody can do that. Most internet drafts have nothing to do with the activities of the IETF, in the sense that there's no approval by the IETF for that, a statement that we're supporting something that an internet draft says. This is something also that the news people seem to have a hard time with, that they don't get the fact that you put in this internet draft and nobody cares, but they see it as the IETF is about to adopt this proposal. Well, that's not the way it works, but be that as it may. And then we've got RFCs. RFCs used to stand for request for comment. They don't anymore. They stand for RFC. Because by the time it gets to be an RFC, it's too late to comment on it. It's the internet draft you comment on. So RFCs now are sort of a brand name. It's just, this is our archival publication. Once an RFC gets published, if our RFC 1234 is published, it never changes. If we have another RFC that replaces it, it gets a new number, and the way you find out that it's replaced, you look in the index. The RFC index says this RFC replaces that RFC. But they're archival documents, they never get changed. The language of the IETF is English. For good or bad, it's English. And it's a restricted set of English when you're doing publications, or it has been. We're in the middle of changing a little bit the way publications are done. Up until now, they've been ASCII English. So it's always had to be printable ASCII characters. So many IETF participants have not been able to include their own name as an author because it doesn't translate into plain ASCII. Accents or non-Roman characters have not been able to be presented. That's being changed. But still, the primary document is the ASCII English. We can say that we can go back and look at RFC 1 and read it, where many standards bodies which adopted Word or something like that, or PostScript, for their document standard, have found out they couldn't read it 10 years later because the software no longer supports it. We can support going all the way back. And that's a big advantage. But it does mean that we've got derision because you can't really draw pictures and things like that because it's pure text. You will see that there are pictures in RFCs. It's called ASCII art. It's all using exclamation points and diagonal lines and up arrows and vertical bars to draw pictures. It is a remarkably laborious thing to do. And it helps to have really good drugs. It's just really hard stuff. But there's a bunch of it out there. But now this revision is allowing more pictures, it's allowing PostScript, it's PDF, and it's allowing other kinds of formats. But the canonical form, the form which is the definitive one, will still be ASCII. And that's being done right at this moment. It's changing over the next few weeks. So internet drafts, random thoughts, things like that. Publish an internet draft and you don't do anything about it, you just publish it, it'll be removed from the main internet draft directory after 6 months. They're not meant to be permanent documents. Now it's moved into another directory where it can be found, Google finds it, things like that. And it's in an archive which we can use, but it's not seen as primary anymore. So internet drafts are moved to this backup directory whenever they time out or when they're replaced. And they can be replaced by an updated version, for example. All RFCs, other than a few specific exceptions, must pre-exist as internet drafts. The reason for that is at the beginning of the internet draft, if you are submitting an internet draft, you are agreeing to abide by the IETF's rules, the intellectual property rights rules and process rules. It says right at the top, the boilerplate at the top of the internet draft. So that by doing so, by submitting that, you are agreeing to the participation rules. So you've got to do that in order to get to be an RFC because we want to be sure that you've agreed participation rules before it comes on RFC. There are some very specific exemptions, but internet drafts have file names, and those file names are useful in figuring out what the the pedigree of the internet draft is, if I write an internet draft myself, it's not part of a working group, the draft name starts with draft-Bradner, because that's indicating the last name of the primary author. No relationship to any working group. It's just I'm publishing my own. If indeed it is the work of a working group, then the name is draft-IETF-working group name. That's the lead into it. So, and then stuff after that is the subject and version number and things like that. Some examples of that are draft IETF IDR-BGP4-26.txt. This was the 26th iteration of trying to get the BGP standard right. It was hard to do because the BGP kept changing, because the vendors, when they were working on this routing protocol, found a bug or found some new condition they hadn't seen before, and they changed it. So they had to go back and change it in the specification. So this took many, many, many years and many revisions. Draft Bradner RFC 3979 BIS-06, it's now up to 08. This is a proposed revision of the IETF's intellectual property rights patent rules, which it's in last call right now. It's being evaluated by the community right now. And then draft IAB RFC format requirements -03 was the third generation of the IABs who manages the RFC editor in the RFC series. Their effort to come up with this new replacing plain text RFC formats. So you can immediately look at an internet draft and see what its generation is. Why is this related to a particular working group? Is this a working group document or an individual document? RFC is a little harder because it's just a number sequence. They could be individuals publishing RFCs. They could be working group publishing RFCs. Maybe RFCs published a very long time ago, long before the IETF existed. RFCs were being published. The first RFC was Host Software by Steve Crocker in 1969. Steve Crocker, who's now the chair of the ICANN board. There are over 7,000 RFCs, not sure exactly how many because many of the numbers were never used, even though we know what the top number is. We don't know which ones weren't used in between. Not all RFCs are standards. Some RFCs are informational, some are individuals' ideas, some RFCs are publications of a company's internal specification for something, just for the community's purpose. You can only tell by looking at the index to see what the story is. So here's the kind of things we've got for RFCs. We've got standards track RFCs, the things that you normally think of as RFCs. It's a standards track. These are the routing protocols, or SIP, the internet telephony protocol, and things like that. There's obsolete standards, things which were good as standards at the time, but they've been overtaken by events, like our RIP version 1 was overtaken by the fact that we no longer assign addresses in class A, B, and C. It's a much more mixed bag. Requirements, so this is a list of, we're going to do a protocol, here are the requirements to do that protocol, or here are the requirements of how to set up a device, the host requirements with that. Policies, this is a document which describe the process for doing something, or the fact we're doing this and which is why. Poetry, this is Vince Cerf's attempt at poetry the night before startup. Some white papers on we did a white paper on what input should be given from the community to the IP Next Generation effort that produced IPv6. It was a white paper calling for white papers. Corporate documentation, I mentioned that. That's a case where a corporation publishes this in order to document something for the community. Another example of this is that the IETF a few years ago, after a great gnashing of teeth and work, decided that we're not going to include wiretapping requirements in our protocols, in our standards track protocols. We're not going to do that, and there were a number of reasons, and they're all documented in an RFC. And reasons such as there wasn't a consistency across the world as to what the requirements are. Putting in a back door is, by definition, making something less secure. and you're supposed to be using end-to-end encryption anyway, in which case wiretapping doesn't help you. So we put in a bunch of things like that. But at the same time, we decided we're not going to put the requirements for describing wiretapping into the protocol itself. We said we encourage companies who are doing wiretapping work that are related to IETF technologies, publish them as RFCs. And Cisco published the way they do wiretapping in their routers, they publish that as an informational RFC. So we know that, and it can be reviewed. When it was being published, it was reviewed to make sure that Cisco got it right as you can in those circumstances. And that's the kind of information that's there. And we have that information. We've got Ascend router, switch documentation, things like that. Some history of experiments, and the IETF process itself is documented in RFCs. The one I left off here is April Fool's Day RFCs. April Fool's Day RFCs are something that John Postel, the original RFC editor, came up with. He published Crispin, I think it was, the Telnet randomly lose option. This is something that looks exactly like a technology standard, except it's for an option for the Telnet interactive protocol that would randomly lose characters. Not as useful a communications protocol as you might have. And he published it on April Fool's Day, which was yesterday, a few years back. And so since then, occasionally, the RFC editor has come across things that look like real, are designed to look like real RFCs, real standards, and are published for the amusement of the community. Did not publish any this year. The RFC editor said that she had not found ones that were worthy of the topic. I have a few of them in the series. I published one called the Firewall Enhancement Protocol with a student of mine, and that's running TCP/IP over HTTP to get through those pesky firewalls. Because it's, you know that you've got it right when, first of all, people yell at you, the firewall people yell at you for doing something to make the firewalls less useful, and you get requests for implementations. And so about half the mail I got was for implementations. It has been implemented, and it works very well, actually. That particular implementation isn't great, and then there was another one, which was the Omniscience Requirements Protocol, Omniscience Requirements, RFC, and that was because we had a senator in the US, Orrin Hatch, who said he wanted to destroy your computer if you were using it for illicit music sharing. Your personal computer, he would come and destroy your computer. And when asked, did he really mean destroy? And he said, yes, he really meant destroy. Well, if you're going to do that, then you have to be omniscient. You have to know that that music is on that machine for some bad purpose. It's not that you purchased it someplace. So I described an omniscience protocol of what you would have to do in order to know that this was okay. So the requirements for an omniscience protocol. And I got well and truly trashed for that, which is exactly what I wanted. People thought I was in bed with Orrin Hatch coming up with ways to destroy people's computers, and that was exactly what you should come up with. And you'll see that the April Fool's Day RFCs, there's some pretty good ones out there. That's one other case where somebody's collected them all into a book, got a couple of people to write introductions, and sold the book. And the IETF, that's just fine. We don't question you to do that. We used to have a 3-step standards process, and I put this slide in to remind you that we do not have a 3-step process, in case you had heard that. We really have 2 different types of standards track processes. One is a 1-step standards process called the Best Current Practice, or BCP. That's mostly used for process documents, such as the IETF standards process itself. But it also is used for how to allocate values in protocols and things like that. It's ways to do things. And it's a 1-step, and this is the best way we know how to do it today. Then we have a 2-step standards track. The first step is what is called proposed standard, and that doesn't mean it's proposed to be a standard. It is a standard at the proposed level. So it means that it's passed through the working group, it's passed through the area director, it's passed through the ISG. All of the problems that people have found have been fixed or documented. So this is the output of the IETF. This is exactly equivalent to the output of most standards bodies. It is something that you don't know that actually works. It's all documented, but you don't necessarily have implemented it. And then the second level of the standards track is internet standard or full standard, and that is where there have been multiple interoperable implementations of the protocol. Now, we don't do multiple interoperable implementations to say how popular it is. That's actually not the problem. That's not the problem we're trying to solve. What we want to do is to ensure that the documentation itself is clear. If you implement it and you implement it, both from the specification without any outside help, and those implementations interoperate, then the documentation was clear. But if you create something and he creates something and they don't talk to each other, that means something in either there's a bug in your implementation or there's something wrong in our documentation. So the multiple interoperable implementations is trying to ensure that the documentation itself is clear. Have a bunch of other RFC types. It's informational, historical, and things like that. Remember that RFCs cannot be changed once they're published. So we can't have something up in the corner of the RFC saying this is a proposed standard or this is a full standard or this has been obsoleted, because that would be a change. And we don't change the documents once they're published. So there's an RFC index, and the RFC index is how you find out what the current status of an RFC is. Always look at the index to make sure that you're dealing with a current document. RFCs are published by the RFC editor. Once upon a time, that was John Postel. One person doing most of the work. He brought on some other people to help him. And then later on, it's turned into a separate organization contracted by the Internet Society for the IETF. We have an RFC editor. And there's a separate oversight group, and there's all kinds of machinations to make this work. There's an editor, and then there's a publisher and a publication arm. The publication itself is being done by the Secretariat, same people that bring you the meeting itself. There's also an independent stream editor. The independent stream is something that came about primarily because John Postel, when he was publishing RFCs, believed that it was, even after the IETF was formed, believed it was important that individual people had access to the RFC series. It shouldn't have to be dominated only coming through the IETF. So there's an independent where you can come up with a technical idea, you send it off to the independent stream editor, and the independent stream editor looks at it for technical competence and for readability, and talks to the independent stream's editor's advisory group. And if everybody agrees, then the independent stream will publish it as an RFC. So it doesn't have to go through the IETF at all. And the way you find that out is, again, through the index. But it's an escape valve. Also, if you create a document that a working group works on but then decides not to progress, you can then take that document to the independent stream editor and get that published most of the time. And that gives you a way to get your information published even if a working group has turned it down. And that's the independent stream editor. This process for IETF submissions is a working group creates the document, hands it off to the area director, hands it off to the ISG, goes off for community review for that last call that I mentioned, back to the ISG can kick it back to the working group or ask for it to be published. For the non-IETF submissions, the independent stream editor, you send off the internet draft or a pointer to the internet draft to the independent stream editor and say, I'd like this published. The independent stream editor talks to their internal, his or her internal advisory group, and then if that internal advisory group says it's ready for, it's okay to publish, the stream editor talks to the IESG to be sure this is not something that directly conflicts with the IETF activities, or something where the IETF leadership, i.e. the ISG, doesn't want to bring it into the IETF for work, because it's seen as something valuable to do. And if none of that's the case, then the independent stream editor can publish it. So that's the mechanism, the mechanics of the IETF is all that stuff. So why are we doing it? What are we doing here, and why are we doing it? Well, when I first started coming to the IETF in 1990, I was told that the IETF scope was above the wire and below the application. But the IETF did not describe how the user interface worked, though actually right after I got here they did when they mucked up FTP and said what your users had to be able to do with FTP. But mostly we don't deal with that, and we didn't deal with wires. We didn't create Ethernet and things like that. But things aren't quite as clear as they once were. The IETF has technology, and particularly in the pseudo-wire area, where we can pretend we can make a fake Ethernet that runs on top of IP. It looks like an Ethernet, it acts like an Ethernet, it's just running on top of IP. And we can make a fake ATM network and a fake frame relay network and a fake optical connection, SONET network. We can do all of those things running on top of IP or MPLS. So you can have IP running on top of frame relay, running on top of IP, running on top of SONET, running on top of IP, running on top of MPLS. Nothing's real in there until you get down to the bottom level, which is the glass. All of the rest is being defined by the IETF, something that looks like that technology. That thing makes things fuzzy. Our scope is pretty fuzzy. And it's particularly fuzzy when we start to talk about the things which now run over the internet. What doesn't? Everything runs over the internet. Telephony, video, everything runs over the internet. And we're working in all of those areas because people have interesting ideas, they have good proposals. We're working in all of those areas, which gets directly into conflict with other standards development organizations. Standards development organizations like ETSI or ITU, which have been in the telephone business for a very long time. Here comes along the IETF and defines internet telephony. Well, wait a second, how'd that happen? They don't like that, and we've got conflicts with that. Some of the other standards organizations have decided that IETF technology is really good, almost. So they take it and they modify it. The ITU has done this 2 or 3 times now, where they've taken a IETF standard and changed it and published it again as their own standard. That's different. Now, there's copyright issues, so they're not supposed to do that, but more particularly, there's interoperability issues for the world. Now, they got an ITU standard that's different than the IETF standard to do the same thing. What do you do there? And that's caused some real conflicts. An example of that is with the ITU over MPLS TP, or Transport Protocol, or it's called TMPLS. And it was a very difficult situation. It went all the way up to the Executive Office of the President of the US to try and resolve this, where the ITU was seeming to take IETF technology and modify it for their own purposes. A little bit of a view of where the IETF sits relative to other organizations. The area in green is the IETF. That includes the IAB, the IESG, all of the areas and all of the working groups within the areas. The IASA, which we'll mention. The RFC editor is not entirely in the IETF because it does this independent submissions process, which is something different. IRTF, Internet Research Task Force, is also not within the IETF. It was a parallel task force at the time the IETF was created. It's managed at some level by the IAB, in that the IAB designates the chair of the IRTF. And the IANA, there's a dotted line to the IANA because the IANA is doing bookkeeping for the IETF, but doing much else as well, and I'll talk about that. The Internet Society is an umbrella now. It was formed in 1992. The IETF agreed to come under the umbrella in 96, but it was formed for 2 purposes. One was to provide a legal umbrella over the IETF, and the other was to continue Larry Landweber's Developing Countries workshops, where we went all over the world and trained the trainers to figure out how to configure routers and things like that. Did that for many years, and some of that's still going on. And the mission of the Internet Society is to promote the open development, evolution, and use of the Internet through the benefit of all people throughout the world. If your company is in the Internet biz one way or another, persuade them to join the Internet Society. The Internet Society helps fund these meetings. It helps fund the activities of the IETF. It also does much else. It does many, many more activities. You can see it on the Internet Society webpage of what other kinds of activities. as security and evangelizing for the internet, being heavily involved in internet governance issues. There's a big internet governance issue going around right now over the IANA and the US government's decision to let go of the IANA to some degree. And all of that activity is stuff that the Internet Society is heavily involved in. Join as an individual member, join as which you can do for free, join as a corporate member, pay some money to help support these functions. So the IETF did agree to come under the legal umbrella in '96. That decision was made through a very long and contentious open working group process. So the decision was made within an IETF structure, within an IETF working group. And it was only after some changes were made in the Internet Society structure that the IETF agreed to be part of the Internet Society. But now it really is. It's a separate activity, but it's under all of the funds, the check you wrote or the credit card that you used to pay for getting into this meeting, that went into an ISOC budget, an ISOC bank account. And then the ISOC pays for any overages. There's going to be quite a bit of overage this particular meeting, and the ISOC will cover that out of its other funds. And you'll hear about that in the administrative plenary. So the ISOC has some pretty deep involvement in the IETF. The chair, the ISOC president appoints the chair of the NOMCOM and things like that. And the IETF returns the favor by appointing some trustees in the Internet Society. The RTF, the Research Task Force, that's looking at things which aren't ready for prime time. They're not ready to actually be turned into standards. They're things which are research projects. Like there was an anti-spam research group. Nobody knows how to stop spam, so that's research. It's not technology. It's not ready for prime time. These are the IRTF research groups that are there now. The ones with a red asterisk are ones that are meeting this week. It's only relatively recent, last decade or so, that the IRTF started regularly meeting. Their research groups started regularly meeting at the IETF. But they're there. Anybody can join into the meetings. And that's seeing what's the cutting edge is, what's beyond the cutting edge, what's coming down the pike day after tomorrow. I mentioned the IAB, the Internet Architecture Board, as the body that had been thrown out when the ISG took over as the standards approval body. But their IAB plays an important role in the external relationships the IETF has. To other standards bodies, they're heavily involved in the internet governance fight and things like that. IAB has a number of internal activities which they do workshops and other things where they're trying to set the technology envelope for the IETF. What's the sort of things that IETF working group should keep in mind when working on particular technologies. Then there's the IANA. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago, the predecessor to the IETF was working on technology where there were values in that technology which had to be the same. So if I send you a packet, there's a field in that packet which has a protocol parameter in it. And it says something like 25. That means email. You and I both have to agree that it means email. So somebody has to write down 25 equals email. John Postel did that. He wrote down those numbers. They have no value to them other than that. All they have to be is consistent. There's no vanity numbers for protocol parameters. They're just numbers. And John did that. Then a little while later, the original Internet protocol, NCP, ARPANET protocol, was replaced by what is now TCP/IP, the Internet protocol. And in doing that, somebody had to write down who was using what IP address. So 128.103.0.0 Class B, that's Harvard's. I got that from John. I sent him off a note one day and said, I need some addresses, John. And he sent me back a note saying, here you are. There's your addresses. So John was running the address, right, at the top level address registry. He then later on reassigned, delegated some of that to different organizations around the world. John was still providing the big blocks, but then RIPE and APNIC and registries, LATNIC, one of our sponsors here, provide addresses to internet service providers and systems and sites within a particular geographic jurisdiction. So John was doing the top level. And then it became clear that using IP addresses to address things was not human friendly. Tell you to go to 128.103.8.36 to get some file, you're going to get that wrong because it's just numbers and people don't do numbers very well, particularly with the phone or something like that. So Paul Markopetris and John came up with this idea of a human-friendly name. That's a domain name, which was used to get translated in real time into IP addresses. And somebody had to record, well, who's going to have the different, it's a hierarchical naming scheme, who's going to have the top-level names? And who's managing those top-level names? John did that. So John was doing these three basic functions of protocol parameters, address assignment, and domain name, top-level domain assignments. Also coordinating the activities of the people who ran the top-level domain servers. John then got other people to come in and help using US government funds to help do that function. That function was called the IANA, the Internet Assigned Numbers Authority. And that was John Postel, and then a bunch of people helped him, paid by the US government to do that. At some point, John decided that it really needed to be something other than a US government function run out of a university. And he decided that he wanted to institutionalize it, was the word he used, to create a new organization to do this function. That organization turned out to be ICANN. After a lot of machinations, it turned out to be ICANN. Within ICANN, there is the IANA function. And the IETF has a relationship with that IANA function only for protocol parameters. We do not relate to the domain name part, and we have tenuous relationship to the IP address part. So, but our IANA, the IETF IANA, is the only part that we're concerned with is protocol parameters. And we have a memorandum of understanding with ICANN to provide that function. But they do provide the protocol parameter function. So if you create a document, an RFC, that is going to ask for a protocol parameter, like a new protocol type, you have to put into your document an IANA consideration section saying, please assign these values to my protocol. And so the IANA then does that function. And that's the big function the IANA does for the IETF. So let's see. What time is it? Okay. So IETF management. Dave Clark's original statement was we don't believe in presidents and the like. Well, at the time when Dave wrote, just before Dave wrote that, IETF management was hereditary in the sense that the IETF chair appointed people to the ISG and to the IAB. The IAB chair appointed people to the IAB. It was not something where the community had an involvement in it. And as part of the overthrow, it turned it into an environment where the community, you and me, are involved in the selection of the IETF management. There's a nominations committee that's formed. The nominations committee picks the candidates to fill these roles. The roles are all voluntary. The IETF does not pay for any participation by any of the management folks, working group chairs, IETF chair, IAB member, ISG member. None of those are paid by the IETF. They're paid by their companies to participate in this. The companies believe that it's worthwhile to have Yari basically full-time in the IETF as IETF chair. That's a value judgment that company has made. Area director job is half to 3/4 time, so the companies that those area directors work for are donating that much effort to the IETF process. We do pay, the IETF does pay for the secretariat, for the independent stream editor, actually the independent stream editor is volunteer, but the RFC editor, and we do pay for those functions. So the folks running around in the black shirts saying secretariat on the back, they're a contract for them. And that's the AMS is the secretariat function, they provide that. There's another group which is the IASA. The IASA is a sort of a middle layer financial management. It has nothing to do with managing the standards process, but it's involved in the venue selection to say where we're going to meet and what the budget is, things like that. So it's a It's this financial and some intellectual property rights management. There's an administrative director. The only IETF employee is Ray Polizzer. He is the IAD, or the IETF administrative director. He's actually an employee of the Internet Society, but this is his job. The IETF is his job. So the ITU has hundreds of employees, the IETF has one, plus a secretariat that we contract for. We also have an IETF trust. This was formed to hold the intellectual property rights of the IETF, the actual documents that are published, RFCs and things like that. Any work that's done under hire, any software that's developed under hire for the IETF, that goes into the IETF trust. It's not a patent pool, it is simply a repository of information. So how do we select these management people? I would say there's a nominations committee that's formed from volunteers from the community. It's quite a bit of work to be a NomCom member, but we've got about 100 or so people volunteer each year. The people who are volunteering for the nominations committee have to have been at 3 of the last 5 physical meetings. The idea there is we want people who actually understand how the IETF actually works on the ground. But then they put out a call for nominations. The 10 of them are selected by random lot to be members of the NomCom. Mike was a NomCom chair at one point. I don't remember how you did the, you're a NomCom member now, yes. I don't remember how you did the selection of the volunteers. Stocks provided random numbers. Okay. The original NomCom chairs wrote the names of volunteers on pieces of paper and put them in a hat and took them down to local priest to pick out the NomComs. Well, actually, John Curran, too. So a number of them did that. That was seen as much too crude and too biased. I don't know, the priest was biased or something. But so we have a IETF member who decided to come up with a better scheme. And that's documented in this RFC here, RFC 7437. And what it does is it comes up with a humongo random number. Oh, that's NomCom operations. Yeah, it's okay. It's on another slide. Yeah, 3797. So comes up, you pre-announce that I'm going to use these values as the seed for my random number generator. Like the number of shares of this particular stock sold in the stock exchange, the Irish lottery, and you come up with like 6 different things, and you put them together to be a random number, and then you use that to churn through the volunteers to see which ones. This is way, way overkill for the function, but it's not that unrepresentative of the way the IETF works sometimes. But the idea is that the NomCom then picks the people that are going to be on the different panels. The IESG, the IETF chair, IAB members, IAOC members. The NomCom picks those. They go to another body to be confirmed, and that body can turn down if they believe that the person wasn't a good person. They can turn down, so it's not a null function. But they're picked from the community. You're now part of the community. While you can't be yet on the NomCom itself, you can nominate people. There's no requirement to have 3 of the last 5 meetings in order to nominate somebody. You can nominate somebody. There'll be a call for nominations coming up in the fall, and if you feel you know somebody that would make a good IETF management person, nominate them. And the NomCom will evaluate those. Mike was showing you his dot. The IETF badges have dots on them. I've got 2 dots here. They look the same color from where you are, I expect. There's a blue dot and a purple dot. The blue dot means I'm a working group co-chair. The purple dot means I'm an IAOC member. The orange dot, like Mike has on there, means he's a member of the nominations committee, the NomCom. And these other ones, red for IAB, yellow for IESG, et cetera. When I was on the ISG, I found the yellow really good because you can't see it from across the room, which means people didn't know that they could buttonhole you to do something for them. But you were still wearing the dot, so if they got close, they could figure it out. So it was sort of a nice has. If you're doing something in a professional standards organization, you have to have an appeals process. An individual who puts forth a proposal and that proposal is turned down by the working group and the individual felt they were improperly treated, there must be a way for that individual to appeal that. So we created an appeals process, relatively late in the game, mid-90s sometime, and that appeals process actually works. Some percentage, 25 or so % of appeals actually succeed. That the ISG is told, no, that was done wrong, or the working group chairs say, that was done wrong, try again. So the appeals process is real. If you feel that your document wasn't properly treated, you can appeal to the appeals process. It's a multi-stage appeals process. You appeal to the level at which insulted you the first time, working group chair, if they turn down your proposal. If you didn't like what they said, you can go up to the ISG. If you don't like what they say, go to the IAB. And that's normally the end of the appeals process, the IAB. There is another step, which goes to the Internet Society Board of Directors, but that's only for the cases where you believe that the standards process itself is faulty, not the execution of the process. If the chair made a bad decision, that doesn't say that the process itself was bad. There have been no appeals to make it to the Board of Trustees yet. I'm surprised at that, but so far there has not been any. The final topic I'm going to talk about is the intellectual property rights. It's a very big issue in any standards organization. There's two different types of intellectual property rights we'll deal with. One is copyright and the other is patents. Copyrights is pretty straightforward. If you write an internet draft, that internet draft on the Pinochle protocol that you wrote, you provide to the IETF the right to publish that. And unless you say differently, you provide to the IETF the right to modify it within the IETF process to create a new document. So provide the derivative rights. But you can't revoke those rights. You give them to the IETF by doing the internet draft. The IETF has the rights forever. You can put a note in the internet draft saying you can't make any derivative works, and that's what happens when we're publishing corporate documentation, for example. We'll put that statement in there saying, no, you can't publish derivative works. You can't modify it. But that's all we're requiring. That document is your document. You have all the rights to the document other than the rights you gave to the IETF to publish it and to create derivative works. Other than that, it's yours. You can take that Pinochle protocol proposal and turn it into the great American novel or the great great German novel or whatever. You can turn it into whatever you want to do. You can take it to another standards body. It's yours. You can send it in little snippets to your mother. Anything you want to do with it, it's yours. The only thing you're giving up to the IETF is the right to publish it. And publish it as an internet draft, and if it makes it through the process, publish it as an RFC. That's the only thing you're giving up. Everything else is yours. That's not the case in some standards bodies where you have to hand over the copyrights. And then patents. Patents are much more harder. Speaking of the RFC editor, patents are a much harder problem. Patents get in the way of a lot of things, but the IETF's process for dealing with patents is knowledge. If you have a patent, I mentioned at this very beginning, if you have a patent and it's related to an IETF technology that you're working on, whether you put in an internet draft describing it or somebody else put an internet draft describing it and you're working on that, then you have to tell us. Leave it up to the working group to decide whether that's important or not, but you have to tell us. You have to disclose the fact you've got the patent. And that requirement is for you individually and personally. And it's for information you have, knowledge you have individually. Not general knowledge. Your company doesn't have to do a exhaustive patent check, patent search for it. It's just you personally. If you know about it, then you have to tell us about it. It's not a particularly onerous thing, but it's very important because that's the way the working groups understand whether this is a technology they want to work on or not. There's more information for newcomers on the IETF homepage. There's an Info for Newcomers button that you can go to. There's a mentoring program, which some of you observed earlier, but there's a formal mentoring program, and you can look at the website to find out more about that and get real mentors. The other training is tutorials later on today. You've been blocked out of the 1 o'clock to 4:50 time because that's right now. But there's an overview of there's IEEE wireless and journeys from internet drafts to RFCs, which is I think why the RFC editor and other people are here. Then later on there's a newcomers meet and greet, which is booze and loud talking. Urge you to go to that. And then there's a welcome reception later on. There is also a newcomers dinner. If you want to go to newcomers dinner, contact the person on the contact Naveen on the sheet here, and they'll be walking to a nearby cost-effective restaurant. So what's next? You're now here. You made the effort to get here. Get on mailing lists, participate in sessions, go to sessions, talk to people in corridors, talk to people at the reception. Become part of the IETF. Make us do better work. Make the technology that comes out of here good, or even better. Make it perfect. Well, we're not going to do that, but make it good. And try to be more polite than some people will be to you, which is a shame, but try and do it anyway. And let's not settle for next best. Let's settle for the best we can do. You're now part of this effort, and welcome to it. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Any questions? Okay, call it a day.